I'm very excited. Anna Miromanova is in the econ department at Lewis and Clark. She's been there since 2023. She holds a PhD in economics from the University of Oregon, another great partner of ours, and specializes in international economics with focus on international trade. Her research focuses on impacts of sanctions on international trade at both aggregate and firm levels, trade policy, multilateral trade agreements, and medical trade and health outcomes. She conducts research on the impacts of lacking labor regulations on the fast fashion industry and fast fashion workers' labor market outcomes in developing countries. And she has been published in top international economics journals, including the Review of International Economics, the Canadian Journal of Economics, and World Economy. So give me a big hand in welcoming Professor Miromanova.
Hello, everyone. How is the volume? Good. Hello, and thank you very much for having me again. I'm excited to be here, and as Tim said, kind of with a little bit of a groundhog scenario. Last year, I focused a lot on kind of the new, the new mercantilism moment, right, where you are trying to protect the domestic industries. There is a big pushback against globalization. There are tariffs, there are non-tariff trade barriers. And this year it's more of a same, but instead of kind of going through the why we are seeing this, I would like to focus more on kind of if we're going to do protectionism, are we at least doing it right? Right, so that's kind of my angle. So you will see that I'm referencing here Prisoner's Dilemma. So today I am being purely mostly an economist. I will show you kind of like a game theory scenario, and I will show you some tables from econ journals. So it might get a little bit, math heavy, but I promise I will explain all of those things and why I'm doing that. So yes, without further ado, we are here in the year of our Lord 2026, and we're kind of seeing the same idea that we've seen since Trump first became president, right? And won election in 2016, took office in 2017, and kind of immediately went into heavy protectionism, imposing pretty high tariffs. But in the first Trump presidency, we saw kind of a focus more on certain countries, right, and certain industries. And a lot of protectionism was given to steel industry, to aluminum industries, and that is a pretty common, those are pretty common industries to receive tariff protections, right? We saw the same thing during Bush administration when he was running for president, because the reason why presidents want to impose tariffs, right, very frequently goes back to gaining political capital. If I give you protection, you vote for me. So that's great. Now what we're seeing is we're seeing something a little bit different, right? We're seeing kind of blanket statements. We're seeing blanket tariffs being imposed. And the first thing that I would like to show you is this statement from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, right? That I am convinced that American workers, farmers, ranchers, and service providers can compete with anyone else in the world, in this market and beyond, so long as they have a level playing field. And this idea of having level playing field is kind of at the core of the current administration's foreign policy, right? We're trying to even out the playing field, whatever that means. Well, let's look at what it means from the perspective of the current administration, right? So we roll out the Liberation Day tariffs, and you probably remember all of this. There were a lot of memes about penguins being tariffed, right? I won't go into that, even though it was highly entertaining. But what I want to show you here, right, is that essentially how we are calculating these tariffs and kind of maybe weighing a little bit from the perspective of an economist on whether that's a good way to calculate those tariffs or not. So reciprocal tariffs here are calculated as the tariff rate necessary to balance bilateral trade deficits between the US and each of our trading partners. This calculation assumes that persistent trade deficits are due to a combination of tariff and non-tariff factors that prevent tariff from balancing. Tariffs work through direct reductions of imports. Reciprocal tariffs rates range from 0% to 99%, with unweighted and import-weighted averages of 20% and 41%. So what I'm going to break down here first and foremost, right, is that we are targeting bilateral trade balance. What is a trade balance? Trade balance simply means we take all of the things that we are exporting, subtract all of the things that a country is importing, right? That's when we are talking about the aggregate trade balance. When we are talking about bilateral trade balance, we do that on the level of a country. And essentially what we are saying here is that we should be exporting and importing exactly the same amount from with every other partner that we have, which is quite an unusual idea, right? So it once again very strongly reminds me of kind of mercantilist movement. And mercantilist movement was essentially the idea that gold is good, right? It's the idea in the 1700s. We want to gather as much gold so we can swim in it like Scrooge McDuck, right? And just feel really good about ourselves. This idea stems from the desire to export more, because if you're exporting more, it means someone is buying from you, right? And import less. But the question then arises, is it possible really to sell something to a partner without also buying from them, right? And the answer is no. In order for the buyer and seller relationship to exist, we need to be willing to buy and sell from each other if we have those things to offer to each other. And essentially this idea that we should be having balanced trade in a bilateral relationship is not economically feasible. It's impossible for the US to sell the same amount to, let's say, Zimbabwe as it buys from Zimbabwe, simply because Zimbabwe is a much smaller country and it doesn't have the market, right, for the amount that we are selling it, and also maybe doesn't frequently have the need. And the same thing for Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe doesn't produce as much as US needs, because US is a much bigger market. So this idea, immediately starting with bilateral trade balance, right, is a pretty, it's a big misconception, and it's a pretty big misunderstanding of how kind of international trade and how trade relationships work in general. I saw someone comparing it to, you know, you going to 7-Eleven, right? And I don't know, you buy 7 Kit Kat bars, but then you also demand that they buy 7 Kit Kat bars from you, even though they got money from you. So it's a little bit, it's a lot unrealistic. So what I want to show you next, right, is this big and scary formula that has been going around, and this is what the Trade Representative Office used to justify the tariffs that we are going to impose, right? This is where those numbers come from, the numbers for the remote uninhabited island, and for China, and for EU, and all of that. So it's not as scary as it seems, and it also has some economic intuition behind it, right? So essentially, when we're looking at the delta tau, tau usually represents tariff barriers for us. So essentially, what we're saying here is that the change in the tariff will be determined by this formula. When we say XI, we just look at the total exports of our partner. So let's say Canada. We're going to subtract everything that we import from Canada, so minus MI. So in Trump's ideal world, the XI and MI are equal to each other, right? The amount that we export to Canada and we buy from Canada are equal to each other, therefore there's no tariff needed. Now we're going to divide it by a bunch of things, and this is where issues arise, right? So first and foremost, we are dividing it by the imports. So essentially, we're trying to find a share, and the share is weighted by some parameters, right? So let's talk about what those parameters are. Epsilon is the elasticity of imports with respect to price. What does it mean? Elasticity is a fancy econ word for how does the quantity change when the price changes. So essentially here what we are asking, right, is when we change the price, by how many % will our value of imports change? Will it change by a lot? Will it change by a little? And what they're doing here, right, is they're saying, okay, we assume that the epsilon is less than 0, which is a valid assumption. And it essentially means if we increase the price of imports, we're going to buy less of those things from the US, right? So our imports are going to fall. But where they kind of lost a lot of the econ community is they were like, well, we're going to set it at 4 based on selected studies. And the authors of said studies that were referenced in this report, right, came out and openly said that the Trade Representative Office misunderstood the calculation of the kind of the elasticity, right? Misunderstood the range of elasticity and is basically using it incorrectly. So we have one parameter being used incorrectly. And essentially what I want you to kind of look at, right, at this number 4. So essentially I'm taking my imports and I'm multiplying them by 4, right? And that's going to really reduce your change in tariff basically by 4. So next, what we're going to do is we're going to multiply it by the pass-through rate. What is a pass-through rate? Pass-through rate simply means that if my tariff increases by, let's say, $1, how much of that dollar is going to be passed on to the consumer and how much of it will be absorbed by the foreign country. And when I say that the foreign country absorbs a tariff, I don't mean that they are literally going to write a check to the US administration, right? What tariffs usually do, the way they work, is they make that foreign market less accessible to us. So they basically reduce the demand in the global market for a certain good. Well, what does that mean? If now there is less demand, the producers frequently are faced with this need to lower their prices. And by being willing to lower those prices, they are absorbing the effects of the tariff, right? So that's what we mean. And so when the statements are made, right, that, I don't know, Mexico is going to pay for the wall, China is going to pay for the tariff, it's the same idea. No one is going to pay for the tariff. The tariff is a tax, and it's going to be paid by the consumer, right? Maybe it's going to be paid by the firms, but the firms also don't get money from, I don't know, the ether, right? They're getting money from the consumers, so they're going to pass some of that on to consumers. And essentially what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, well, our change in tariff also has to be dependent on the pass-through rate. And the pass-through rate, right, is going to basically increase the prices within the country. And we've seen some of the impacts of the change of tariff on prices, but what I want to kind of emphasize with this formula, one, it has some economic justification, but where it falls short is, one, it looks at bilateral relationship rather than looking at trade in aggregate, because it's impossible to have balanced trade within every country pair. That's one. Two, it is choosing parameters from studies arbitrarily, and then the authors of those studies have said, right, that those parameters are used incorrectly. So to me, that kind of really reduces the legitimacy of this formula. But okay, so let's assume that we are going to go with it and we are going to impose the tariff, right? We don't like that, I don't know, someone is taking advantage of us. So we are going to use the protectionist instrument. We'll assume that for now, we'll be gracious, right? So what I would like to show you next is, first and foremost, kind of the idea why tariffs will most always use retaliation, and we've seen that, right? We see that once Trump announces tariffs, other countries also respond with retaliation. And also we will talk about if we want to go with the route of tariff, what's a better version than doing this, right? And I'll show you. We actually have an answer. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the prisoner's dilemma. And have we ever heard of this term before? Probably, right? It's kind of on the, in the zeitgeist. But I would like to illustrate it from a perspective of an economist, and also how we use this tool to show why tariffs are always going to cause losses, right? Tariffs are always going to end up losing us things. So what we have in this table, we call it a payoff matrix, right? In the game theory context, we have two players. We have prisoner A and prisoner B, and they have been captured. I've heard so many different variations of the stories. One of them almost always features like a Soviet prisoner, right? So I'm like, sure, why not? Let's do. One of them is Soviet, if that helps relate to the prisoner, we'll do that. So essentially, the idea here is we are looking at a non-cooperative game, right? We cannot cooperate when we are making our decisions. And the idea is that if I confess, right, or betray to my crime, I will be able to walk away free while the other person will bear the brunt of the punishment. And what I want to show here is how we end up in a Nash equilibrium that basically makes us work against our best interest, right? For us, the best thing would be is to both stay silent, do 1 year in prison, and go home. But what I will show you is that most of the time what happens is we both end up betraying each other and serving more than we needed to. And the same thing happens with tariffs. So here we go, right? Usually the way we think about it is we say, okay, well, I'm prisoner B, right? And I am going to stay silent. Now, A is responding to my strategy. I, as B, have decided to stay silent. What is the best thing for A to do? Would they choose to serve 1 year in prison by staying silent, or would they choose to betray? They would choose to betray, which is why there is this little highlight, right? All right, we're gonna do the same thing for all four kind of pairings, betray / stay silent. If B chooses to betray, what should A do? Well, A can choose to stay silent and get 3 years in prison, or can choose to betray and get 2 years. 2 years in prison is better than 3 years in prison. No years in prison, of course, ideal, but this is not the world we're living in, right? So this illustrates to you, right, that no matter what B does, the best thing for prisoner A to do is to betray as well. And the same thing is going to happen for prisoner A. When prisoner A is prisoner B, when it's responding to what A is doing, right, we're going to choose betray every time. And what that does is it lands us in that lower quadrant on the right-hand side where both A and B betray each other, right? And they serve 2 years in prison when very easily they could have stayed silent and do only 1 year. But this is because they cannot cooperate. So now let me show you how this guy applies to the tariffs. So if we're thinking about, yes, Nash equilibrium, lose-lose strategy. So when we're thinking about international trade, in international trade, we are always going to be thinking about what we call terms of trade. In terms of trade, it's just the relationship between price of exports to the price of imports. And this is where the issues kind of start arising. When countries impose tariffs, it's going to affect global prices if a country is large enough. Tariffs themselves are not morally good or morally bad, right? They're just an instrument. Developing countries very frequently rely on tariffs, and that is because developing countries rely on them to get the missing tax revenue, right? Because for the developing countries, frequently there are also issues with corruption, there are issues with non-reporting of the taxes, but tariff is a very easy thing to collect, right? You get it at the port, you collect your taxes, everything is good to go. Now you can pay for certain things. Developing countries, however, tend to be smaller economies that have smaller markets and smaller production. So when they impose distortionary economic policies, they don't tend to spill over onto the international markets. But when big countries like the US impose tariffs, they tend to have consequences for the other countries as well. So as I kind of chatted a little bit about in the beginning, right, when a large country imposes a tariff, that tends to reduce the demand for the product of that country in the global market. So that means that my price of exports for the foreign agent is going to go down, right? And essentially, I, as a country that imposed the tariff, has gained some because now I was able to protect my industry, I was able to collect some government revenue, but I also imposed economic harm on my counterpart, right? Because their producers now kind of have to take lower prices in the international markets. And this is where this idea of terms of trade going to come in when we're thinking about tariffs and their impacts on the kind of the global world. So here we are, right? Same idea. We are looking at two countries, country A and country B. They can choose free trade and they can choose a tariff. And the same thing that happens with the prisoner's dilemma happens with the tariffs. Both countries are going to end up choosing tariffs because they are trying to get the gains without getting harms, right? But it's impossible really to impose a tariff and expect that the other country is not going to retaliate. So if US retaliates, countries that it imposes tariffs on is also going to retaliate. And so we are going to always end up in a lose-lose strategy from the Nash equilibrium perspective. Now, this is where this really cool thing comes together, right? Like trade agreements. Trade agreements is a really, really important instrument of not just trade, but also maintaining kind of general cordial relationships among countries, right? So both can gain from trade, both can see improvement of terms of trade, because when countries open up to free trade, or at least freer trade, what we tend to see is that price of exports tends to rise, price of imports tends to fall, so you have an increase in the terms of trade gain, right? If we want to abstract from the terms of trade gain, we'll just say, well, it's always nicer for a domestic producer to be able to sell at a higher price abroad, and it's nicer for domestic consumers to be able to pay a lower price for certain goods, right? Because other countries can produce it at a lower price, and that's what comparative advantage is all about. And this is what, and I kind of loosely labeled it as WTO, not just WTO, right? Trade agreements force this outcome. Trade agreements can be free trade agreements, right? Like we had between Canada, Mexico, and the US, used to be called NAFTA, now it's called USMCA, I believe, right? So WTO is now an organization, but it also wasn't always there, right? It came together in 1995, and basically what it does, it enforces the GATT, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, that came together in 1940s after the World War II was done, right? And we're kind of deciding the new global order at the Bretton Woods Conference. We create a bunch of institutions, among them the IMF, the World Bank, and the GATT, to kind of improve those relationships. And so WTO here is going to serve this purpose. It's going to force us, right, into both of us gaining from free trade, because now we have a platform to negotiate, we have a platform to talk, and we have a platform to agree. So now we both can lower our guard, we can reduce our tariffs, and we can benefit more from free trade. Now, am I saying that WTO is perfect and there are no issues? Of course not, right? Because WTO, we'll see this a little bit later in the talk, but WTO also has interests that it guards, and most of the time those interests align with big corporation interests, right? They're not always aligning with small farmers or, I don't know, mom and pop shops. They're trying to maximize gains from trade, and maximizing gains from trade means we're going to do things the cheapest way, which most of the time means we want to do economies of scale, which simply means we're going to produce as much as possible and our cost goes down. Well, if you're looking at a small business or a small farm, that's not always a scenario, right? If you're thinking about two people trying to grow veggies, they're not necessarily going to be able to grow, I don't know, million potatoes, right? Can be a little bit hard, but at least WTO gives us a platform to discuss those ideas. So now that we are kind of disregarding WTO, I want to say a little bit, but honestly a lot, because WTO appellate body has not been functioning properly, so essentially there is no room for countries to have negotiations about the things that they perceived were done wrong onto them. And a lot of it is because US is refusing to support the elections of the panel body, judges, basically. So, yeah. But now that we understand how tariffs work, right, a little bit more, why tariffs are not always beneficial, and that it would be better for us to be in the upper right-hand side quadrant rather than over there at the bottom, we're going to say, okay, we will throw all that rationale out of the window, right? We don't like this. We feel like someone is taking advantage out of us. We can't really prove it, but we feel it. Let's do it, right? Let's do it. So if we want to do it, if we want to say, that's fine, we are going to impose tariffs. Well, what Trump administration chose for tariffs really wasn't ideal, and it definitely didn't maximize the economic surplus. And I will show you that there is actually now a better tariff, if you will, right? And I am, Anna Ignatenko and her co-authors wrote this paper in 2025, right after the liberation tariffs, day tariffs kind of rolled around. And, I was a little bit anxious. I was like, what are you doing, right? Why are you giving them ideas? But at least I want to show you that the tariffs that were proposed really weren't following, like, the best practices in econ, the best practices in welfare maximization. And I don't know why I was expecting them to, right? But at least this is kind of the gripe that I have it. So, reciprocal retaliation to the tariffs results in net welfare losses in the US economy, right? Because once again, we talked about if I impose tariffs, the other countries are going to retaliate. They are not going to be happy with it. And essentially what they show is that the bilateral tariffs imposed on certain countries using that formula is not an ideal tariff. And the ideal tariff that would maximize US's surplus would be 19%, uniformly applied across all trading partners and determined solely by the aggregate trade deficit, rather than bilateral imbalances, because once again, we can't expect to sell and buy the same amount within a country pair, right? That's not how international trade works. All right, so this brings me kind of to the idea of there is such a thing as an optimum tariff, and the same logic applies to an optimum tax, right? Because tariff is going to have its benefits, but it's also going to have its losses. And at some point, those two are going to equal each other. And when they become equal each other, we would call that the optimum tariff, right? And essentially what this graph shows us, we have national welfare on the vertical axis. When we talk about national welfare, we usually think about economic welfare. And economic welfare comes from three sources. It comes from consumer surplus. So what benefits do consumers get? It comes from producer surplus, right? So what are the producer benefits? And from the government revenue. You will see that as the tariff increases, the national welfare increases. And it makes sense because with a tariff, prices go up, so that tends to increase the producer revenue, and that also tends to increase government revenue, right? But at some point, we reach the place where the benefits of tariff outweigh the costs, because the costs is that now it's more expensive for consumers. So consumer surplus starts shrinking. So at that optimum tariff, we're kind of finding that perfect point, right, where producers are the happiest they can be, and consumers are kind of on the brink of that collapse. So this is what they're talking about, right, in this paper. When they say the optimal tariff is 19%, this is what we are thinking about. I won't go through all of the numbers. What I want you to see from these tables is that most of them have a negative sign in front, right? And the negative sign in front simply means because we're looking at the change in welfare, so we're looking at the change in the benefits. We're looking at the change in deficit, so what is happening with our trade deficit, so exports minus imports. Relative exports to GDP, we won't worry about it, the same for imports. Employment, I think, is an important thing, right? So that's going to be in the fifth column. And in the sixth column, we have change in prices, because tariffs tend to increase prices, and US has already been struggling with some inflationary pressures, right? So tariffs tend to increase prices and contribute more to those inflationary pressures. So what I want to show here, right, is that the tariffs that we have chosen, that the administration has chosen, right, does lead to some modest increase in welfare, but at the same time, it leads to really huge change in prices, right? We have pretty big price increase, very modest change in employment of less than 0.5%. Now, this happens essentially if we do it, if we just impose it and we kind of absorb the government revenue. The better thing, some might say, to do, right? Take that government revenue from the tariff and send everyone a check. Well, that actually reduces our welfare. You can see in this case too, right? Our welfare has fallen. And why is that? Well, that is because taxes and subsidies tend to have what we call multiplier effect, right? So if you kind of you take it out of the system and you don't really put it back in. So we are kind of getting rid of that reduction, right? Because what are you going to do with that $2,000? A lot of people are just going to put it in a savings account. Some people are going to spend it, so it's not going to do much. Now, let's think about what's going to happen if we actually impose an optimal US tariff, right? So optimal is the 19% on everyone. Well, we actually will see a bigger increase in welfare. We would see about 2% increase compared to 1.13% increase, right? So this is, once again, when we don't understand how tariffs work, we don't understand how aggregate trade works, and end up making decisions that don't really benefit us, right, and kind of create a lot of just harm, this is what happens. Same thing here. I just want to show you that this is now with retaliation. This was the case without retaliation. No country retaliates. They take it, they say, yes, we will pay the tariffs. Now, countries retaliate. What do we see? It's all negative. When countries retaliate, right, we're going to see a reduction in welfare, we're going to see a reduction in, we're going to see some reduction in deficit, right? So that's, if that's our goal and we are willing to forego some losses and we just want to see the trade balance increase, that's fine, we can do that. We also see decrease in employment, and we also see pretty high increase in prices, right? More inflationary pressures. So we could have had it all, right? As our Lord and Savior Adele once said, but we didn't. So essentially, all we are saying here is that we could have imposed tariffs that would reduce our trade deficit, but we didn't use the optimal tariff, and so now we're just ending up with this, right? And we're ending up with retaliation and all of that good stuff. So I want to wrap up my talk on thinking about this incredible documentary that I saw, I think, in November, and it's called WTO 99, and it is about the protests in Seattle, right, following the meeting of the WTO delegation and how quickly those protests escalated. It is a documentary, and the director of the documentary sifted through thousands of hours of archival footage and put it together in a really, really incredible film. So if you're looking for something to watch kind of on this topic, I think this is a very good, this is a very, very good film to see. And the reason why I bring it up is because I think what is happening right now, right, kind of this big push towards anti-globalization and this really big push towards imposing tariff is a response to the hurts that we are seeing across the US communities, right? A lot of US communities have been very vocal about opposing WTO. And in my view as an economist, I think there was a lot of kind of misinformation, right, about what WTO does and kind of what it means. But at the same time, WTO, a lot of the negotiations happened in secrecy. So it's very difficult to feel like you are being represented when everything is happening behind closed doors. So I think a lot of those concerns are very legitimate. And WTO frequently takes the side of a bigger guy, just because, once again, they're pursuing free trade, they're pursuing maximization of the welfare, and that means kind of reduction of the cost, right? And I want to leave us kind of with this idea that if we want to, improve the things and kind of correct the course of history and how far it has gone, right? We shouldn't be addressing like tariffs, we should be addressing inequality, and we should be addressing the distributional effects of tariffs and the distributional effects of taxes. And I think this is where a lot of the protesters were coming from, right? And last time I talked to this audience we talked a lot about the distributional tariffs, and that globalization very frequently is pitched as the rising tide that lifts all boats. But the truth is it lifts some boats more than it lifts others, right? Because the distributional effects of globalizations were not discussed, they were not studied. And I remember last time someone in this audience came and talked to me, and they were like, yeah, they were actually exclusively prohibited from studying those distributional welfare effects. And I believe that, right? Because if we say globalization is really great, it's going to do great things for everyone, yeah, we are more willing to give it a go. When in reality, you would say, hey, well, it's actually gonna really benefit Coca-Cola, right? But like if you're a mom and pop shop, probably not so much, right? So what I want to kind of leave us with is that we need a Calder-Hicks improvement, and Calder-Hicks improvement is simply this idea that if we have a policy that benefits some but harms the others, the winners should compensate the losers in theory. And my point is I think we should get rid of the theory, right? And kind of include that distributional effects kind of by default into those policies. All right, I'm done. Thank you.
So I probably should have given a math trigger warning before this started. I know that my humanities background certainly gets challenged by it. But I'm going to ask the first question, and then I see a question behind me here.
Oh, yes.
So if tariffs were once viewed as an economic problem but are now seen by some as a solution, what does this reversal reveal about how people understand globalization, which you sort of hinted at, and economic power? And what does this mean for you as an economist? How do you do your job?
So let me break down the question into two, right? Essentially, what do we do with the reversal of globalization as an economist? And how do we understand it from the perspective of like economic theory?
Well, no, the tariffs. The tariffs were once viewed as an economic problem, but are now seen as a solution to said problem.
Yes. So I think it's kind of viewing the same. It's viewing the same tool from different perspectives, right? It's a problem when we want globalization. It's a solution when we don't want globalization. And I think now, because we are switching from pro-free trade sentiment to anti-free trade sentiment, I think there is really no, what is it called? There is no, it's the same thing, basically, right? Like I'm viewing tariffs still as either an impediment if I don't want it, and as a solution if I want it. And now we want it. So I think as an economist, it is a little bit challenging because a lot of the times economists spend a lot of our careers, right, arguing pro-free trade. But I do think that there are a lot of economists who understand that, once again, free trade is beneficial on aggregate, but the distributional effects is what we don't understand. And so now more economists are going into the distributional impacts of those policies. And so I think we will see more and more work done on the distributional impacts of those policies. And I hope that we will take those and implement them, right? Once again, Calder-Hicks without the in theory part.
Thank you. I'm going to have to think about a lot of what you've said. My one comment or question is, I don't like the use of the word welfare. I would rather have benefits, because every time you said welfare, I think, is this going to put more people on welfare?
Fair.
It's my problem, it's not yours.
Fair. It is, I'm using a lot of econ jargon, and I apologize. I think last time I did more of a kind of political economy angle, and this time I really wanted to be an economist because I think it's beneficial. But yes, economic welfare is a frequent term that we use, but that makes sense.
Hi. One of the things that surprised me in the reading was the statement that the U.S. share of global gross domestic product has stayed fairly stable from 74 to 2015, 2024, they say, at 25 to 30%. I was under the impression that we were 50% post-war. Maybe if you change the dates, do the numbers change? But my impression was that the U.S. has dramatically declined in its share of global gross domestic product. And that seems to be, I'm wrong.
US is the biggest economy in the world, right? Followed by China. So US economy is very big. And I think where some of those misconceptions could come from, my guess, is that we do see a pretty dramatic decline in manufacturing, right? But it doesn't mean that we are no longer producing things, because US now mostly focuses on services heavily, right? It focuses on capital goods rather than maybe consumer goods. So some of those sentiments, I think, permeate the media, right? And we hear kind of horror stories that manufacturing in the US is dead. And in a sense, it could be true, but we also have other industries that do not require manufacturing, but instead rely on like soft skills and services.
Очень хорошо, спасибо. That's the limit of my Russian today, so.
I loved it, thank you.
Спасибо. You may have mentioned this as part of your remarks, but let me ask to create a greater problem. With the tariffs that are clearly vindictively retaliatory and very spontaneous, that are going up and down and threatens high, high, high and low, and how does that all figure in? Or has it never been measured before?
It has. This is an excellent question. So what we usually, the instrument that we use to measure that is called trade policy uncertainty. And there are several ways of measuring it. And the newest ones focus on social media indexes, right? So it used to be Twitter when Twitter was still Twitter, right, and not X. And today there is one study that is looking at all of kind of announcements using the Truth Social or Truth Media, whatever it's called. So yes, we measure that. It's called trade policy uncertainty, and trade policy uncertainty very clearly is correlated with lower producer sentiment. So that tends to reduce the volumes of trade because it kind of puts you in this position of what's going on. The effects are not as pronounced as tariffs, but there are definitely some effects there we see.
I appreciate your analysis and your presentation today. Tim's going to hate me because I'm going to ask you to just respond to a couple thoughts. The distributional aspect in earlier trade debates in the U.S., like fast track, part of the trade-off was worker retraining to mitigate globalization. That side of the equation never really panned out. The specious analysis of what's happening now is that all that foreign investment will recreate our industrial base. Again, specious, but I was wondering if anybody in the literature now is examining that impact and its past failure. Trump won. Last piece is, could you speak a little bit to all of this discussion on tariffs completely ignores the services side.
Yes.
We are a services-based economy. GM used to be the largest employer. Now it's Walmart and Amazon. So if you could just speak to a little bit of the impact of services as part of this debate.
Absolutely. I'll start with services and then I'll go back because it's kind of the one freshest in my mind. So when we're thinking about services, US economy is the service economy. If you look at the trade balance, right, and typically what we see is trade balance including only physical goods, and you will see that US trade balance has dipped into negative and stayed in the negative for a very long time. But if you include services, there is a pretty sizable reduction. I don't remember the numbers, I don't want to lie, but it definitely brings us closer to kind of that balanced trade, because services are more difficult to measure, services are more difficult to conceptualize, so we tend to focus more on physical goods. But absolutely, if we take into account services, US is not as in the red with trade as it would be otherwise. In terms of labor and like capital, right, investment redistributions, I'm sure that there is literature discussing that. I haven't looked into the literature, so I wouldn't know. Yeah.
You made a few comments ago relative to trade, and I think what I want to focus on here is the question of whether we, as well as our trading partners, will be better off with no or minimal tariffs on both sides, and for us to take our knowledge that we have and focus on those areas that we have expertise, as opposed to what we seem to be doing, from my perspective, is a regression back to, call it smokestack industries, if you will.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point, and essentially that's kind of what trade is conceptualized as, right? We are doing something we have comparative advantage in, and comparative advantage means we have the lowest opportunity cost, right? So I can produce it most effectively, and US produces most effectively things that use high-skilled labor, right? It produces most effectively services, and essentially, yes, importing things that we don't have that comparative advantage in. Yes, economists would agree with you. David Ricardo would be your biggest fan because he was the one who like kind of pioneered the idea of comparative advantage. I think the problem comes in my opinion, right, and I think some of it is also speculation, is that COVID threw a pretty big wrench, and it kind of showed us how unreliable the global supply chains can be. And so a lot of countries now started thinking, well, what if something like this happens again? I should be able to produce all of those things myself, right? So in an ideal world, we would produce things that we are good at, we would buy things from other people. But in reality, I think there is also a lot of kind of fear about depending on someone else for those things. Yeah.
Well, thank you for being here today and your sharing. I'm going to set up an unrealistic scenario. So if Trump were to sit down with you and ask for your opinion on if there's any changes you think should be made, what would you suggest?
As an economist or as a human being? You know, I would probably suggest firing the whoever came up with the formula, right, and whoever came up with the idea of the tariffs. And you know, I would love for us to go back to the free trade world, or at least the status quo that existed before the tariffs. I am not sure that that would fly with our trade partners, right? Because as long, I think, as Trump is in office, there is a still pretty big element of surprise and uncertainty. And so I think if, like, you know, I sat down with him and I really talked him into it, and he was like, yes, 100%, there is no guarantee that tomorrow he wouldn't take it back, right? And so I think that my perspective, I would try to go back, but also, I don't really want to have that conversation, but thank you for posing the question.
So we're coming up on time, but I've got a question from our audience over at Mirabella, which is, what do you think is going to happen with the Supreme Court, and will they overturn IEEPA? And what will it mean if various other tariffs live on per other statutes?
So I am not a Supreme Court expert, right? I don't know how they make decisions. I don't know those odds, so I'm always very careful kind of speaking onto that. I will say that if the tariffs do live on, I think, you know, I will speak as a perspective, on this perspective as a Russian, right? The worst day of my life probably was February 22nd, 2022, right, when my country invaded another country. And you just think that the world is completely gone, it will never be the same. And then the worst thing happens is you adapt. And so I think we will probably see the same thing with tariffs, right? If they remain, we will adapt, and we'll kind of figure it out from there. Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have a better answer, but it is what it is.
Great, thank you so much. So we are at time. Big hand for
Thank
Professor
you.
Miromanova. I encourage you all, if you have not read the article, to read the article, and it does get dense to try and track what, you know, the technical terms mean, but I mean, these things do matter because it does come back, as we're always being, as we understand it, to us. I mean, it comes back to the consumer, so it is, the more we know, the better we can understand and make our voices heard around the policies that affect us all. I want to thank you again for coming. Next week, we're going to do something a little different. And the topic for next week is America's global role, foreign policy's next chapter. And we've heard a lot of discussion so far about the breaking of the international order, you know, things never being the same. So I've invited two different folks, Sean Smallman from Portland State University and Matt Scroggs from Lewis and Clark College, both of whom teach Intro to International Relations. And so I was very curious about when the rules don't exist or the rules have been changed mid-game, how do you begin to codify and teach to a generation this notion of what international relations is? And I was very curious in talking with both of them, what are the conversations you're having in your classrooms with students today? How are Gen Zs understanding global relations, the U.S. in a global matrix? And I just think that there's a lot to dive into there. So we're going to have much more of a conversation next week on what they're thinking, how they're thinking, and because it has everything to do with what we're doing here. This is lifelong learning. We're an extension of that classroom. And so come with questions and think about what are the risks of isolationism and diminished influence? What is the role of trust? What does it mean to be a good neighbor? All those things. Read the chapter, come next week, and I think it's going to be a great conversation. And thanks again for being here.